once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our special guest author and host here on EWTN, Dr. Benjamin Weicker, author of Saints versus Scoundrels, Debating Life's Greatest Questions, published by EWTN, and also a second book, In Defense of Nature, Emmaus Road Publishing. Always great to have you here.
Thanks for having me back.
Dr. Weicker, over the years, multiple books you've written, and Saints versus Scoundrels. Let's talk about that one first.
Great. Absolutely.
Debating Life's Greatest Questions. A little near and dear to my heart, I can say, because of the fact that it comes out of a program that EWTN has created working directly with you. I mean, you're really the source and summit of the material that's being put together since you write the scripts, etc. So let's talk about what Saints versus Scoundrels was and is as a show. You're still taping them as we speak.
Even as we speak.
Even
yes.
as we speak.
Even as we speak.
And what's the idea behind it, and what makes a saint and what makes a scoundrel? Because in certain cases, there's people showing up like Flannery OConnor, who takes the role of a saint, but she's not a saint in a Catholic sense directly. Or
not officially, yes.
Officially.
But given what she went through in her life, you think, well, she's got to be pretty close. But what we're looking for in these shows is for people to understand that, first of all, we have real people whose choices and in regard to what they do and what they think not only affects them, but it affects a whole lot of other people. So you have somebody like Ayn Rand, who wrote Atlas Shrugged. She has had a malignant effect on so many people. Millions and millions of copies of this book have been sold, and people don't understand what she was like as a person and how that was related to her view of human beings and her arguments in Atlas Shrugged. And what we do with Flannery OConnor is bring the two against each other. Here's two women writers, one writing about the truth. Flannery O'Connor is a very Catholic writer, but an edgy one. Ayn Rand, an atheist, a materialist. She absolutely detests the idea of God, hates Christianity. Have them hammer together, and yes, it's fiction. They did live at the same time, but they never met. But what would happen if they did meet? Because these are real people whose ideas could change.
Right, but the scripts themselves are based around things that they have said in life and juxtaposed with one another as a response back and forth. Now, did Flannery OConnor usually carry a gun? Well,
I think she might have wanted to, but she does have a gun in one of her most famous short stories. Good Man is Hard to Find, and so we incorporate that into it. Because the lesson of Good Man is Hard to Find is, well, when we come up against death, that's when you find out what you really believe. And so Ayn Rand, yes, she said all these things about how God doesn't exist and so on in her life, but what would happen if a gun were pointed at her head? What would she really say? And so we do that. Now we want to...
That could be a challenge for Christian, though,
That could be a challenge for everyone.
Right?
And Flannery O'Connor says that herself,
Now, the idea behind this and of the show itself was you're in your study and, and these personalities from history show up. What I thought was interesting about, and what you note in the beginning of this, is that you're not visited by ghosts. You're visited by men and women who, in a sense, don't know they're dead. They show up in pairs, acting and arguing just like they did when they were alive, except that they're in your living room. And they also have no past context, meaning they're not looking back at history and reflecting their views upon it. They are reflecting the views they held at the time.
At the time, and they emerge. They don't know anything that they didn't know at the time. And so they don't know what's going to happen to them. They don't know the effect that they will have on history. So when you have Henry VIII come, and we have Thomas More, who's obviously a contemporary, but we bring him out of the tower, and we put them together again and said, if they could have come together again, could St. Thomas More have changed his mind? History would have been a lot different if that scoundrel, Henry VIII, could have been turned into a saint. And vast number of lives and a lot of carnage could have been avoided. So can it happen? Well, it could have happened in their lives. That's what we're trying to get people to understand. It really does make a difference what you think and what you do.
Well, the introduction, you say, we tend to think that we are each giving our own answers to these great questions. If we study history, however, we find out that almost all of us are disciples of this or that thinker whose arguments were immensely influential and so were passed down to us, sometimes directly through education, sometimes indirectly through culture. And so, again, you're hitting on that idea that so many of us, and the idea with a lot of this was with Nietzsche and some of these other Ayn Rand, these famous people, is that they have these wonderful little expressions about God, or, you know, what does not kill me makes me stronger, and people quote this all the time, and they don't realize the thinker behind that and the life behind that thinking.
Exactly. So they want to quote Nietzsche, which is that quote, but they don't understand how weak the man was. He couldn't even see. He was in horrible health. And that for him was an excruciating, you know, a cry out in his defiance against God. So Nietzsche himself didn't get stronger. He went insane, and we have him go insane on the program just like he did in life. Of course, we compact it, but this is what it really meant.
I thought it was because he couldn't get out of your study.
That's what the problem was. Help him, please, where there's no outer doors.
And who was he arguing with?
He was against Edith Stein.
Right.
And then there's a connection there because Nietzsche's ideas really did help. Nietzsche's before Nazism. Dies before that, but his ideas have spread all over Germany and formed part of the philosophical foundation of the Third Reich, and that is what killed Edith Stein as a Jew. So they meet and argue about you know, those very ideas. And Edith Stein is also a philosopher. She had a PhD in philosophy, you know, which Nietzsche didn't know until they met. So, you know, they could have a philosophical argument, but it wasn't just about words. She will lose her life because of the kinds of arguments that he made.
Right. You also say, and one of the other ones is St. Francis and Machiavelli. Okay. And you say, the great atheist Machiavelli so despised Franciscans because he despised Christianity that I'm not sure he would have deigned to talk to the saint if he had been contemporaries. So, in a sense, we forced them into this crucible,
and that
where they're forced to react to each other.
But in the show, Machiavelli is not very polite, and he's not happy about it. In fact, he gives St. Francis a nice whack.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you said he spit cola all over your bookshelf?
I'm still mad about that.
Okay.
On my
and
copy,
you were surprised at which of the saints and scoundrels put cream in their coffee? Was that?
That was Agustin. That was Agustin, and.
Now, you also, because we talk about the idea of it being out of time in the sense like that, there's a certain amount of their distraction as well as to, and you use this again for a little bit of humor into the script to make it entertaining as well as educational, the idea of like lights or a phone or you discuss about something on the internet or the web, and obviously they don't have an idea what you're actually talking about. Now, you write the scripts and you do the show. Now, when you do the book, is this just a book of scripts?
No.
Okay.
I have to use the word translate because it really is a different medium. Visually is much different than putting it down as a work of fiction. So what I did is I transformed it into fiction, and but it isn't just transformed into fiction. I have a lot of other reflections, the kinds of things that you don't have time for when you're doing a show of 25 minutes. So I put in a lot of, let's think more deeply about this and let's reflect on what they said and what they did. What does that mean for us? So you have the substance of the shows, but with a lot more meat that I can get in because, frankly, I got a little more room.
Okay, so when you first went about doing this, let's say St. Agustin and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, first of all, how did you decide who should be in conflict with another? And then when you did the research, did you write one part first and then follow with a second part? Did you write them back and forth? Were there key ideas that you realized I need to make sure that there's a valid exposition of both of their thought?
Always we look for something that links the two. And with St. Augustine, you have his Confessions. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau actually wrote a book, The Confessions, which was the anti-book. He really believed that he was, as an atheist, he was overthrowing St. Augustine and the horrible effect of Christianity. So you've got them able to to come at loggerheads about some common thing. So we have Flannery OConnor, who's a writer, and Ayn Rand, who's a writer. Of course, you have St. Thomas More and Henry VIII.
They were put together by history.
They were put together by history,
so yeah, right. You say, and this is in the section on reflections, because you kind of go through the story, kind of the adaptation of the script, and you have a reflection, as you indicated, kind of in each chapter. You say, to come at it from another angle, young Agustin was a sinner, but the ceaseless prayers of his mother, St. Monica, wonderfully answered by God, and so he returned to the church. What if Rousseau's father had been as devout and as devoted to his child as St. Monica was to hers? What was the story? I know Rousseau would leave his kids in... you know, foundling homes and stuff. Is that what happened to him too? Or?
Well, Rousseau's father basically abandoned him. His mother died after giving birth to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So we're bringing out this very human element, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau reminded his father of his dead mother. You know, you saw the resemblance, and he would say that to him. So you imagine as a child, you know, you look like your mother, the mother who died, you know, giving you birth. So he always carried that
felt blame for his mother's death.
He always felt blame for his mother's death. And then the father later just abandoned him. And so that's part of it. You know, it's part of, he doesn't just become bad. There's a bad situation, and we need to take that into account.
And why is it today with somebody, you know, Rousseau, he's a French guy, he's before the French Revolution, etc. Where do we see him reflected in today's societal thought?
About everything.
Okay.
You know, Rousseau influenced our understanding of politics, of ethics, of even evolution. Actually, he was an evolutionist before Darwin, of education. So, as you mentioned, he was one of the chief architects of the French Revolution, even though he wouldn't, you know, he died before that.
Right.
But the French Revolution took his ideas, get rid of Christianity, create a new religion, a civil religion, and literally get rid of Christianity means removing the Christians, mainly their heads, and start up a purely secular society and leave Christianity behind, wipe it out of history. And so that's the scourge of the French Revolution, why it got so horribly bloody. But there are many other ways. Rousseau is one of the most
It's what happens when we actually become too fully human.
Yeah, in his sense, you say, you know, we leave out the divine and you become a beast. As Aristotle says, a beast worst, the worst kind of beast.
Right. Well, it's also interesting in the St. Francis and Machiavelli, you talk about we are free to be evil. That is frightening truth, for free even in the face of a miracle. And you talk about how Machiavelli's opinions of the church, you know, Pope Alexander VI and the Borgias and the boys, you know, and obviously he was, you know, was a lot of city-state conflict going on in Italy at the time, and he was involved with politics, and so he had a lot of reasons why he didn't like the church. But you say it also leads us to a very serious final reflection because of the fact that there were a lot of bad things going on in the church. Each Christian is responsible for being an argument for the truth of Christianity. For if we are bad Christians, we are then become a bad argument.
Yeah. And I don't want to say that. It's one of those things that's, you know, you think, well, what kind of an argument am I? You know, and I have to look at myself because once you realize, you see somebody like Machiavelli sees church corruption, and he becomes the great modern atheist, really the first great modern atheist, and causes all kinds of problems. But what if he had seen a holy church? What if he had seen holy popes? What if he had seen holy Franciscans at that time? We don't know the effect we're going to have on other people. And hypocrisy is not a good potion. It creates a disdain for the church teaching, and we're responsible for it.
Let's look at Machiavelli. So people talk about the Prince is the most famous one. It's short, everybody reads it. But how do we see that reflected, especially in politics today?
And we see everything's Machiavelli. It's simply, look, folks, there's no good or evil. You do what it takes, and the only good prince, as he says, is an effective prince. And an effective prince means you do what has to. What
if you got to be nice, you're nice. You got to be tough, ruthless. You got to be ruthless.
If you slit throats, but above
totally
all,
pragmatic.
Well, it's pragmatic in the worst sense. It's he had to lay the distinction between good and evil to the side, and that meant he had to put God to the side, the soul to the side. and say all that matters
The end
is
justifies the means.
the end justifies the means. Yeah,
That's
exactly.
a good
That's
way
Machiavelli.
kind of like we hear with the Alinsky in a later day as well, in a sense. And we were talking about Ayn Rand and her, and a lot of people, even in a conservative side, have a lot of affinity for Ayn Rand, maybe from a economic or somewhat philosophical. You say, Ayn Rand lived out her philosophy. The single-minded pursuit of her own happiness brought about the misery of everyone around her. If that's the effect of living out the philosophy of Ayn Rand in the life of Ayn Rand, then how much good can it do for anyone else?
Yeah.
I mean, she really preaches the gospel of selfishness, basically.
Yeah, and she doesn't shy away from calling it that. Selfishness for her is a virtue. You only look after yourself. Whatever happens after that, let it be so.
Right.
And people look at that and say, well, that's liberating. Gosh, I always wanted to pursue my own self-interest. Let's see how it looked in Ayn Rand's life. She was an awful, wretched woman in every sense. There was nothing admirable about her. She alienated everyone, was cruel to her husband, had all kinds of affairs. So when you actually look at her, she is the embodiment of her philosophy, and that's what we try to do in Saints versus Scoundrels. This is what it looks like to live it out. It's not pretty.
Right, exactly, because it turns in on itself. That's what happens with so
Yeah.
many of those things. I fear that our own democracy is becoming a different kind of tyranny, one that bids us to remain comfortable amidst growing chaos and moral disorder. In return for our acquiescence, we are implicitly promised, as Henry promised Thomas, feather beds rather than crosses. Is that not only what society, but in many people in the church are looking for?
Well, it's all too human, isn't it? You think, okay, is there an escape clause from around this cross thing? And Christianity preaches the cross because of the fallenness of the world. There is a political movement beginning all the way back, goes all the way back to Machiavelli and forward, saying, let's give people comfort in this world. That's what they really want. The whole heaven, hell thing, no, just get rid of that. Give them comfort in this world. And in doing that, it draws us to becoming simply servants of the flesh. You think it's going to turn out well, what happens is moral chaos. You can't act against your own nature. You have a soul. If you destroy yourself...
Whether you believe it or not.
Whether you believe it or not. And so you can't help but destroy yourself if you act as if you're only a pleasure and comfort-seeking being.
Right. And the one thing I think we've seen, too, if you take that kind of nihilistic, Epicurean kind of view of things, you always have to do more and more and more to really receive the same high effect. We acclimate very quickly. This is very comfortable. But to be more comfortable a week from now, I need more comfort.
I need more comfort.
I need more excitement. I need something has got to keep. And that's why I think many times, as somebody who's worked in the entertainment industry, you see people get more and more bizarre.
Exactly.
Because it has to get stranger and stranger and stranger to get that same kick out of the same thing.
If you
kind of like using a drug.
It's exactly
you have
like
to just raise the level.
Yeah, and if you can't embrace what is truly our nature, then there's only one thing left, and that's what's unnatural. And there's no limit to the unnatural.
Well, speaking of natural and unnatural, we'll move from Saints versus Scoundrels, debating life's greatest questions, to another book in our closing minutes called In Defense of Nature, the Catholic Unity of Environmental, Economic, and Moral Ecology. And in reading this book, the thing that struck me was the fact that, it's not, somebody might say, oh, Ben Weicker writes a book, he's going to take on all the tree huggers and stand up for that fact. But actually, you try to give a very balanced view, which is really what the church is. I mean, I was reading this, and I always think the Catholic position is always both and.
Exactly.
It's always, we can care for creation and still do other things.
Yes.
It doesn't mean we go overboard one way or the other.
Exactly.
We're not ruthlessly destroying it for our own pleasure and for our own use. At the same time, we're not going out of our way to make life difficult for everybody else in the universe because we want to make sure that the garden keeps growing outside my house.
Yeah, and that's the both and is exactly it, because I'm trying to get the left and the right together, because we're as Pope Francis said, schizophrenic now. To say, look, we're defending all of nature. Okay, you on the left, you're right about defending the environment, and you on the other side, you're right about defending human nature. Why don't we just defend both? And sometimes Christians react to these guys are just hugging trees, they're pagans, and they're for gay marriage and abortion. Therefore, the best thing for me to do is be against gay marriage and abortion and saw down trees indiscriminately and drive my SUV. No, you don't need to do that. You can care for both. And once Christians wake up when you say it's creation, folks.
Right.
Do you think God wants us to treat creation this way?
What would you say to somebody who would say, for the vast majority, let's say, of Christians, that's a caricature, meaning the pro-life movement, they do care about all those other things.
Yeah.
They may see, in a certain sense, that obviously because of the nature of life, at the beginning and the end, that there's a hierarchy of truths there.
Yeah.
But the idea that because you're pro-life, you suddenly hate trees is a canard, clearly.
Yeah.
On the other side, it's probably for a lot of other people too, who, because they care about the environment doesn't mean they don't care about life.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes the media, because it likes to make black and white distinctions and be able to label people, uses that on people when it's really not like that and out there.
That's a great point, because really the caricatures come from the extremes, but the extremes are out there, but that's all you see the media pointing at. I'm just going to point the extreme because that makes good television, that sells. But if what I'm trying to do is get the people who are still sane on both sides to say, let's make it the both and, nature and human nature.
Right, and when you say nature and human nature, okay, what's that distinction you're trying to, what's that additive you're putting into this ecology discussion?
Well, really, and then now I'm quoting a pope, and actually several popes in this phrase, there's a moral ecology, because we're part of nature. Our human nature defines what Catholics call the natural law. God has defined what is good for us by defining our nature as rational animals made in the image of God. And that's why we can talk about a moral ecology. We can talk about the pollution of the environment. Here's industrial waste going into, that's bad. Okay, what about moral pollution? What about sexual pollution? What about the pollution of our bodies through gluttony? The various things we can talk about now have common ground between how we talk about ecology and how we can talk about moral ecology, and hopefully that gets everyone to see, maybe we are talking about one big Catholic universal picture. Right.
And you talk about that in the beginning of the book. You talk about your simple argument. There's four main points you make, and you also talk about the fact, let's see those on the right as self-righteous women hitting Bible thumpers, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, caricatures.
Yeah. But the thing that struck me too was the way you were trying to get into that human aspect and that moral pollution. And the other thing that struck me was, now people in the Old Testament were tree huggers?
Yes, they were. You can hug trees. You can hug the cedars of Lebanon, but you just can't carve them into gods.
Okay.
Right? Because think of all the Psalms singing the glory of creation, because this is something God has made, and it's wonderful. And for Catholics, we need to remember that it's part of our dogmatic understanding that you can understand that God exists through what He has created. So nature is a means to come to God.
Now you say here, the problem is not only what each side wants to avoid, but what each side pursues as progress. What do you mean?
Yeah. Well, on one side, so say the extreme right, what you have is we are progressing if we're economically progressing. We're making money, we're generating profits, and whatever happens to the environment happens to the environment, because that means progress, economic expansion. And the other side, progress means greater and greater freedom to manipulate our bodies any way we want. You would think, wait a second, folks. Both of you have maybe half right, but really on the side that you have half wrong, you really blow it, because you're both running roughshod over the limits, the intrinsic good order of nature, and you recognize it on your own side. The right understands there are moral limits, part of our nature.
Right.
The left understands there's limits in the natural environment that we got to respect. Okay, just switch it around and say, respect the other side.
And what do you mean a Catholic ecology with a small c?
Well, the original meaning of Catholic is universal. And all I'm trying to get both sides to say is, let's have a universal ecology.
Right.
Let's respect the intrinsic order of nature.
Not just for Catholics, but for everyone.
For everyone. Small c, it's universal, but it's universal in yes, both senses. Everyone can come into this. We got common ground, but also universal. That common ground includes nature and human nature, because we're natural things. You know, we're not ghosts and machines. That would be a heresy
Right.
of Gnosticism.
Right.
You know, we really are meant to be embodied. That's why there's a resurrection. That's why there's an incarnation.
Even if the Police did an album with that name in it.
Yes.
You know,
Ba-dum-ba.
if you say, if we are, in fact, moral beings by nature, meaning not that we are naturally good, but that we are the one particular animal that has to both know and choose well in order to act well in regards to ourselves and to nature, then we can be held morally accountable for what we do to our own nature and to our environment.
Yeah, and that's a kind of a tweak to the left, saying, look, you guys on the extreme tend to be more relativists, but then you can't turn around and say you shouldn't pollute the water.
Right.
Because one thing is we're the only creatures that can pollute the water, and if there's any sense to should, then you must believe there's a moral universe.
Right, and
where
does that come from? And
yeah.
for libertarians, the idea of saying, well, I can do whatever I want, well, that has, everything has a, you know, resultant situation
Exactly.
to an opposite effect.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
very good. Another book in the works?
Oh yes, well, another book in the works. I am now writing a book with Scott Hahn, which is a more popular version of a book we did about the politicizing of the Bible.
Oh, right. I was going to say you guys had done a book together.
We did, and it's a way thicky.
It's a big book.
Yeah,
it's
not
a big book.
It's not casual reading at night, and so we need to get a version that is that's more able to be digested.
Okay, very good. And highly digestible in Defense of Nature, the Catholic Unity of Environmental, Economic, and Moral Ecology, Ben Weicker. And of course, one that's close to my heart, Saints versus Scoundrels, Debating Life's Greatest Questions, published by EWTN Publishing, both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. And don't forget to check out the series, EWTN.com, find out when it's airing. I'm Doug Keck, and thank you for joining us here on Bookmark.